The foyer's chandelier cost more than my salary, a fact my mother often mentioned. I stood there in grease-stained coveralls, the scent of motor oil clinging to me. Jessica laughed nearby, unaware I had arrived. Standard procedure. Parents mocked me for being the dumb one, while they praised my sister nonstop. They said I'd never amount to anything. Then one day, a $59 million check landed in my hands, and in that moment, they finally realized how wrong they'd been. But first, I had to survive tonight. I stepped onto the marble, my work boots squeaking against the stone. Conversations died instantly. 36 heads turned, their gazes sliding from my dirty hands to my father's horrified expression. Jessica broke the silence first, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. She stepped forward, swirling her champagne. "Tyler, you made it. I assume you're here to fix the downstairs toilet." The guests were complaining. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd. I didn't flinch, though my jaw tightened enough to ache. My father didn't rush to defend me. Instead, he smoothed his tuxedo and raised his glass, pivoting back to his speech. "Let's not let the help distract us," he announced, his eyes locking onto mine with cold indifference. "Tonight is about excellence. It is about Jessica, who just secured the merger that will define this family's legacy." He smiled at her, pride radiating from him like heat. Some children build empires. Others just get in the way. The insult landed like a physical blow, leaving me breathless. Before I could retreat, the heavy front doors swung open. This wasn't another guest. A man in a gray suit entered, clutching a leather portfolio. He didn't look at the partygoers or the champagne towers. He scanned the room until he found me. My father stepped forward, assuming the business was for him. "Whatever this is, leave it in the study," he commanded. The stranger ignored him, walking past the host to stand directly in front of me. The room went dead silent. "Mr. Tyler Sterling?" the courier asked. I nodded, wiping my greasy palms on my pant legs before reaching out. He handed me a heavy cream envelope sealed with red wax. It looked archaic, something from a different century. "Priority delivery from the estate of Arthur Sterling," the man said. "My grandfather." The name sucked the air out of the room. Jessica stopped smiling. My father's glass lowered. They hadn't spoken that name in 5 years, not since the funeral they barely attended. "This is a mistake," my mother hissed. "Arthur left everything to the company trust. Tyler gets nothing." The courier turned, tipping his head. "This was held in a separate blind trust. It matures today?" He looked back at me. "Do not open this until you are alone, sir." He left immediately. I looked down at the envelope. It was dense with paperwork. The silence was suffocating, but the weight in my hand felt heavier, like a weapon I didn't know how to use yet. I didn't open the envelope that night. I took it back to my studio apartment, placed it on the chipped laminate table, and stared at the wax seal until the red began to blur. The smell of oil on my hands triggered a memory so sharp it stung. 10 years ago, the air had smelled exactly like this. Not of expensive cologne or champagne, but of rust, gasoline, and possibility. I was 17, hiding in the only place that felt safe, Grandfather Arthur's garage. We were restoring a 1967 Mustang, a wreck my father had called scrap metal, before selling it to Arthur for $1. Arthur handed me a wrench without looking, his hand steady despite the tremors that usually plagued his writing. "Your father sees a rusted frame," he said, his voice gravelly and warm, "but you see the engine underneath." He tapped his temple with a grease-stained finger. "That's not stupidity, Tyler, that is vision. They read books. You read the world." I tightened the bolt, feeling the metal bite into the threads. "Dad says I'm wasting my time," I mumbled, wiping sweat from my forehead. Arthur stopped working. He grabbed my shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong for a dying man. "Listen to me. One day they will need what you know. They will look at their spreadsheets and see nothing, while you see the structural failure." He looked toward the main house. "When that day comes, I want to make sure you have the hammer." The memory faded, leaving me alone in my silent apartment. The streetlights outside cast long, orange shadows across the floor, highlighting the grease stains on my coveralls. My hands trembled as I finally cracked the red wax. It crumbled onto the table like dried blood. Inside, there wasn't a will in the traditional sense. There was a letter handwritten on yellow legal pad paper and a cashier's check face down. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was erratic, hasty, but undeniably Arthur's. "Dear Tyler," the letter began. The ink faded in places. "If you are reading this, two things have happened. I am dead, and your father has finally proven he values his pride more than his blood." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The letter explained everything. Arthur hadn't trusted his son with his private patent portfolio. He knew my father would sell it for quick cash to fund Jessica's vanity projects. So, he had locked it away in a blind trust, waiting for a signal. I moved the letter aside to look at the check. I expected a few $1,000s, maybe enough to buy a new truck or pay off my credit cards. I flipped the paper over. My breath hitched in my throat. The number didn't make sense. It was too long. $59 million. It wasn't just an inheritance. It was 10 years of accumulated royalties from a fuel injection system Arthur, and I had tinkered with that summer. He had patented it in my name. But the money was the secondary shock. Underneath the check was a legal document titled Shareholder Rights. By owning the patent, I didn't just have cash. I held the controlling interest in the specific technology Sterling Industries relied on for their government contracts. My father's empire was built on a foundation I now owned. I sat back, the cheap plastic chair creaking under my weight. Grandpa didn't just leave me money, he left me the leash, and they didn't even know they were wearing it. The brass plaque read Sterling and Associates, polished to a mirror finish that distorted my nervous reflection. I tugged at the collar of my only suit, a polyester blend I'd bought for a cousin's funeral. It felt tight across the shoulders. Inside, the office didn't smell like the sterile cleaners of my father's headquarters. It smelled of mahogany, leather, and old paper. A receptionist didn't even ask my name. She simply pointed toward a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. Elias Sterling sat behind a desk that looked like a fortress. He was older than the courier from Friday, with silver hair combed back severely and gray eyes that assessed my worth in seconds. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he gestured to the leather chair opposite him. "You opened the envelope," he stated, not asking. "Then you know the numbers are accurate. $59 million, gathered over a decade of licensing fees that were diverted to this trust." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. "Is it legal?" I finally managed. "My father thinks he owns everything Arthur touched." Sterling leaned forward, clasping his manicured hands. "Your father owns the shell. You own the engine. But there is a condition attached to the trust's release." He slid a thick binder across the desk. "To verify the royalty calculations, the beneficiary must conduct a full audit of Sterling Industries. You have to open their books, Tyler." I stared at the binder. An audit wasn't just math, it was a declaration of war. "They'll destroy me," I whispered. "They have teams of lawyers. I fix air conditioners. If I start digging, they'll find a way to bury me before I see a dime." The voice of my mother echoed in my head, telling me I wasn't smart enough to handle a checkbook, let alone a corporation. I began to push the binder back. "Maybe I just take a settlement." Sterling stopped the binder with one finger. "Before you surrender, look at page 4. I opened it to a 2015 bank statement. "That was your college fund," Sterling explained coolly. "Your grandfather fully funded it. Your parents liquidated it 3 weeks after your high school graduation." I looked at the withdrawal line. The amount matched the cost of the sailboat Jessica had crashed that same summer. They hadn't just cut me off, they had stolen my future to buy her a toy. The shame I'd carried for years evaporated, replaced by a rage that clarified my vision. They told me I wasn't smart enough for college while spending my tuition on fiberglass repairs. "I want the audit," I said, my voice steady for the first time. "I want to see every receipt." Sterling nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. "Good, because we don't have time for a settlement negotiation. We barely have time to breathe. We have a crisis developing right now." He tapped a new document, a confidential memo stamped with today's date. "My sources indicate your father is rushing to sell Sterling Industries to private equity by Friday." He looked me dead in the eye. "If that sale closes, they claim ownership of all intellectual assets, including your patent. We would be tied up in court for decades." He handed me a technician's badge. "They weren't just mean Tyler. They were thieves, and you are the only cop on the beat." The service elevator smelled of old hydraulic fluid and stale coffee, a scent that clung to the gray fabric of my work uniform. I adjusted my tool belt. checking the weight of the encrypted flash drive Sterling had given me. It sat heavy in my pocket against my thigh, a cold reminder of the stakes. When the doors opened on the executive floor, nobody looked up. I was just the maintenance guy, a fixture as invisible as the drywall. I walked straight past the receptionist. HVAC fluctuations in the server room, I muttered, pointing vaguely at the ceiling tiles without making eye contact. She waved me through, her eyes never leaving her computer screen. I stepped into the hallway, keeping my head down and my pace steady. The invisibility I had hated for years was now my greatest asset. I reached the server room door and swiped my master keycard. The light turned green. I slipped inside, the heavy door sealing out the hushed quiet of the corporate office. The server room was a freezer, humming with the aggressive drone of industrial cooling fans. I didn't need the servers yet, though. I needed the acoustics. I dragged a fiberglass step ladder to the far wall and popped the acoustic tile leading to the shared plenum space above the CEO's office. The dust was thick, tasting like chalk in my throat. I held my breath, listening. Voices drifted through the thin metal ductwork, distorted but unmistakable. My father was shouting, panic edging his baritone voice. "We cannot show them the Q3 actuals." "Jessica!" My father sounded desperate, a tone I had never heard directed at anyone but me. "If the buyers see the liquidity gap, the valuation drops by 40%. We'll be underwater." I pressed my phone against the vent, the recording app running. The irony was sharp enough to cut. The man who lectured me on fiscal responsibility for buying good boots was currently drowning in debt he had hidden from the shareholders. He was a fraud. Jessica's voice answered him, smoother and terrifyingly calm. "Stop sweating, Dad. It ruins the suit. We aren't showing them Q3. We shift the liability to the dormant R&D accounts until the ink dries." I froze on the ladder, gripping the rung until my knuckles turned white. R&D. That was my grandfather's division. That was my money. She wasn't just hiding losses. She was burying them in the very trust they thought was empty. They were using my inheritance as a landfill for their incompetence. "What about the maintenance staff?" my father asked, the sound of ice clinking in a glass echoing through the vent. "The new owners will want their own team." Jessica laughed, a sharp sound that felt like a slap. "You mean Tyler, please? I've already drafted his termination letter. We hand it to him Friday at 5 p.m. We tell him it's a redundancy layoff so he doesn't make a scene." She paused. "It's a kindness, really. He'd only embarrass the new owners." I climbed down, my hands shaking with a cold rage. Recording them wasn't enough. I needed the paper trail. I plugged Sterling's flash drive into the unattended admin terminal. Bypassing the firewall with the admin codes I'd memorized years ago, I searched for Jessica's draft folder. There it was. Not just a termination letter, but a memo to legal. Subject: internal embezzlement investigation, suspect T. Sterling. They weren't just firing me, they were planning to frame me for the missing funds. The file transfer bar crawled across the screen, agonizingly slow. 90%. 95. Done. I yanked the drive out just as the door handle to the server room jiggled. I dove behind the rack of blinking servers, heart hammering against my ribs. A security guard peeked in, scanned the empty room, and left. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. They wanted to paint me as the villain, so I decided to become the one thing they feared most, the boss. The dining room was silent except for the scrape of silver against porcelain. I sat at the far end of the table, the spot usually reserved for unwanted guests. My mother scrutinized my collar, looking for grease stains that weren't there. I cleared my throat, the sound loud in the cavernous space. "I found a garage space on 4th Street, I said, keeping my voice level. "I need a loan for the down payment. 50,000. I'll pay it back with interest." Jessica stopped chewing, a smirk playing on her lips. She exchanged a look with our father, a silent communication of shared disdain. "A garage?" she asked, as if I had suggested building a mud hut. "Tyler, we aren't a bank for hobbies. Real estate requires capital and business acumen. You have neither." My father didn't even look up from his steak. "We are in the middle of a complex merger, son. We don't have liquid cash for high-risk ventures." I gripped the table edge. "You bought a sailboat for 3 times that amount last summer." I reminded them. "I'm asking for an investment in my future. I have clients waiting." My mother sighed, placing her napkin on the table with deliberate slowness. That boat is an asset for client entertainment. Your shop would be a liability. We are trying to protect you from failure, Tyler. You simply aren't built for management. You're good with your hands. Stay there." Jessica leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malice. "Let's be honest, it's not about the money. It's about the brand. A sterling in grease, stained coveralls running a chop shop. It's embarrassing." She took a sip of wine. "We're upgrading the family image. You don't fit the new portfolio. To be blunt, Tyler, you are a bad investment. We can't have you dragging down the valuation right before the sale." The cruelty was casual, efficient, and absolute. My father finally wiped his mouth and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the mahogany surface. It stopped inches from my hand. "Since we are discussing your future, we've made a decision regarding your employment at headquarters." He didn't blink. "With the merger approaching, we are streamlining operations. Your position is being eliminated effective immediately. This is a severance check, $500. Consider it a generous buffer while you look elsewhere." I looked at the check. $500 to erase 25 years of loyalty. It was less than they spent on wine tonight. But instead of anger, I felt a strange, cold relief. This was it. The final severance of any moral obligation I held toward them. I picked up the check, folding it neatly into my pocket next to the flash drive containing their crimes. "Thank you," I said softly. "This clarifies exactly where I stand." "I'm glad you're being reasonable," my mother said, signaling the server to clear the plates. "It's for the best." I stood up, pushing my chair in. They went back to their meal, already forgetting I was in the room. I walked out into the cool night air, the heavy front door clicking shut behind me. I patted my pocket. I had a $500 check in one hand and a $59 million grenade in the other. It was time to pull the pin. The boardroom on the 42nd floor was a glass aquarium of sharks. I stood outside the frosted doors, smoothing the grease stain on my coveralls. Inside, the muffled baritone of my father's voice promised stability to the private equity vultures. I checked my watch. 9 a.m. The merger was moments away from being signed. I pushed the doors open with both hands. The heavy thud of the latch engaging silenced the room instantly. Every head turned, and the polished atmosphere shattered against the reality of my dirty boots. Jessica stood at the head of the table, a laser pointer frozen on a projected growth chart. Her face twisted from corporate polish to raw indignation. "Security," she barked at the intercom, her voice cracking. "We have an intruder." My father stood up, his face reddening. "Tyler, this is the final straw. You are fired. Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." The investors, 3 men in expensive Italian suits, looked between the furious CEO and the mechanic, amused by the spectacle. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," a calm voice cut through the tension. Elias Sterling stepped out from behind me, flanked by 2 junior associates carrying thick banker's boxes. The atmosphere shifted from annoyance to confusion. My father recognized the lawyer instantly, and the color drained from his face. "Elias, you have no business here. This is a closed meeting." Sterling ignored him, walking calmly to the empty chair at the foot of the table. "Actually, we have every right to be here." Sterling placed a single sheet of paper on the mahogany. "You are attempting to sell Sterling Industries," he announced, his voice projecting clearly. "However, you cannot sell what you do not fully own." Jessica scoffed, slamming her hand down on the table. "We own 100% of the voting shares. This is a waste of time." I stepped forward then, moving to the table. "You own the building," I said, locking eyes with her. "But you don't own the product you are selling." I reached into my pocket, bypassing the $500 severance check to pull out the cashier's check for $59 million. I slid it down the long mahogany table. It spun slowly, stopping right in front of the lead investor. He looked down, his eyebrows shooting up. "That is the accumulated royalty payout for the Sterling fuel injection system," I said. "My grandfather didn't leave that patent to the company. He left it to me, and I have never signed a licensing agreement." My father stared at the check, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Arthur put that in the general trust." Sterling shook his head. "He put it in a blind trust, revocable only by his grandson upon specific conditions. Conditions you triggered when you tried to liquidate the company." The lead investor picked up the check, verifying the bank stamp. He looked at my father with cold calculation. You listed this IP as a wholly owned asset. That is fraud. Jessica tried to salvage the sinking ship. This is a technicality, she insisted, though her hands were shaking violently. We can draft a licensing agreement right now. Tyler will sign it. She looked at me, forcing a desperate, terrifying smile. We're family, right? We can work this out. We'll cut you in on the sale proceeds. The audacity was breathtaking. 10 minutes ago I was a liability to be erased. Now I was their only lifeline. The shift made my stomach turn. I looked at the investors, ignoring my sister completely. I will not sign, I stated clearly. I am not licensing this technology to this board. Without the patent, the company you are buying is just a real estate holding firm with significant debts. The lead investor stood up, buttoning his jacket. We aren't interested in real estate, he said, turning his back on my father. This meeting is adjourned. We will be reviewing our legal options regarding the intentional misrepresentation of assets. The sound of the investors leaving was the only noise in the room until the door clicked shut. My father collapsed into his chair, looking 20 years older. Jessica stared at the blank projection screen, her career evaporating in real time. You ruined us, she whispered, tears finally spilling over. You burned it all down. I shook my head, feeling the ghost of my grandfather standing beside me in the quiet room. I didn't burn it, I said. I just took back what was mine. The door opened again. The lead investor stuck his head back in. He didn't look at the CEO or the heir apparent. He looked at the guy in the grease-stained coveralls. Mr. Sterling, he said, addressing me with a respect my family never showed. If you decide to license that technology elsewhere, or if you decide to restructure management here, give us a call. We invest in the tech, not the suits. He handed me his card. The balance of power had permanently shifted. The boardroom door clicked shut, leaving a silence heavier than the screaming. My father loosened his tie, his hands trembling for the first time in my memory. The invincible facade had cracked, revealing a scared old man underneath. Tyler, he started, his voice quivering with a desperate attempt at warmth. We acted rashly, emotions were high. He walked around the table, reaching out to touch my shoulder. I stepped back sharply. The physical rejection hit him harder than the financial one. He froze, hand hovering in empty space. Don't, I said, my voice flat. You spent 20 years calling me slow because it made you feel superior. Now you want to play happy family because I hold the checkbook. Jessica wiped her eyes, her makeup smearing into a dark bruise on her cheek. We were protecting the legacy, she argued weakly. Everything we did was for the name. I laughed, a harsh sound. You were protecting your lifestyle. You stole my college fund for a boat. That isn't legacy, Jessica. That is larceny. Elias Sterling opened his briefcase, the snap of the latches echoing like gunshots. We are moving past the emotional context, he stated clinically. We are now discussing criminal liability. He placed a red folder on the table. I have authorized a forensic audit of the R&D accounts. Based on the preliminary data Tyler acquired, we are looking at 7 counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. He looked at Jessica. The sentencing guidelines for this amount of money start at 15 years in federal prison. Jessica paled, her skin turning the color of ash. You can't prove intent, she stammered. I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the screen. The recording from the HVAC vent filled the room. We shift the liability to the dormant R&D accounts. I've already drafted his termination letter. My father closed his eyes as his own voice discussed framing me. The audio was crisp, undeniable, and damning. I didn't just fix the AC, I said. I fixed the leak in your security. The betrayal that followed was immediate. Jessica spun on our father, her eyes wild. He told me to do it, she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at the man who had given her everything. I was just following the CEO's orders. I shouldn't go to jail for his mismanagement. My father looked at her, heartbreak finally piercing his vanity. The golden child was willing to sacrifice him to save herself. I watched them tear each other apart, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold resolve. Stop, I commanded. They both froze. I am not interested in watching you cannibalize each other. I want this finished. I signaled Sterling. He slid 2 documents across the table. Option A is the audit. We hand this recording to the FBI, and you both go to prison. I tapped the second stack. Option B, you resign immediately. You surrender all voting rights. In exchange, I grant you a fixed monthly allowance. It won't be millions, but you won't starve. My father looked at the resignation letter. It was a surrender of his entire identity. And the house? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The estate stays in the family trust, I answered. You can live there, but you don't own it. You can't mortgage it, you can't sell it, and you certainly can't host parties to brag about money you don't have. He picked up the pen. His hand shook violently, but he signed. The scratch of the nib sounded like a dying breath. Jessica stared at the papers, refusing to touch them. I can still run operations, she bargained, desperate to keep a shred of power. You need someone who knows the clients. You're a mechanic, Tyler. You can't run a corporation. I looked at her, seeing the fear behind the arrogance. You are right. I can't run it alone, but I know how to hire people who can. I looked past her to the corner of the room where the quiet company accountant had been taking notes. Mr. Henderson, I called out. The accountant jumped, dropping his pen. He had been invisible to my family for a decade, just like me. You caught the discrepancy in Q3 last year, didn't you? The one Jessica ignored. He nodded slowly. Yes, sir. I turned back to my sister. Effective immediately, Mr. Henderson is the interim CEO. He values accuracy over appearance. Jessica gasped, realizing she was being replaced by the one person she had mocked for being boring. I picked up the signed resignation papers. My work here was done. You have 1 hour to clear your personal effects. I told them. Security will escort you out. I turned to leave, walking toward the heavy glass doors. Tyler, wait. Jessica called out, her voice cracking. What are we supposed to do? I stopped but didn't look back. I suggest you learn a trade, I said. I hear mechanics make good money. I walked out. The hydraulic lift hissed softly, raising the vintage Jaguar to eye level. This wasn't a dark, cramped garage anymore. It was the flagship location of Sterling Restorations, a glass and steel cathedral dedicated to combustion engines. I wiped my hands on a clean rag, admiring the sunlight filtering through the high skylights. I owned the building, the tools, and the land, but I still wore coveralls. My staff handled the paperwork, I handled the torque wrenches. It was the life I wanted, just amplified. I finally felt like myself. My assistant, a sharp kid named Leo who reminded me of myself at 18, walked in carrying the mail. He hesitated before handing me a thick, cream-colored envelope. I recognized the stationery immediately. It was the same heavy stock my mother used for her gala invitations. I didn't feel the old dread anymore, just a mild annoyance. I tore it open. Inside was a handwritten card asking me to host Thanksgiving at the estate. It would be nice to have the family together, she wrote. 3 months ago, that request would have sent me into a spiral of guilt. I would have wondered if they had changed, if they finally respected me. Now, I saw it for what it was, a desperate bid for relevance. They wanted to be seen with the winner. I grabbed a pen and scribbled a reply on the back of their own card. I have plans, enjoy the turkey. I handed it back to Leo. Return to sender, I said. The guilt never came. A familiar gray sedan pulled into the bay entrance. Elias Sterling stepped out, looking out of place among the impact wrenches and oil drums. He didn't mind the grease this time. He walked over, inspecting the Jaguar with a nod of approval. Henderson sent the quarterly report. Elias said, leaning against a tool chest. Revenue is up 12%. Turns out, paying vendors on time is a good strategy. He smiled. Your grandfather would be proud. You fixed the engine just like you promised. I wiped a smudge from the fender, feeling the cool metal under my fingers. It's not finished yet, I told him. I want to authorize the trade school initiative. We had discussed it for weeks. A full scholarship program for kids who learned better with their hands than with books. Kids like me. Elias pulled a file from his jacket. The Arthur Sterling Foundation papers are ready for your signature. I signed them on the workbench, right next to a scattered set of spark plugs. Before Elias left, he pointed to the frame hanging in my office. It wasn't a diploma or an award. It was a shadow box containing 2 checks. The top one was the $59 million payout. Below it, crumpled and smoothed back out, was the $500 severance check my father had thrown at me. One represented my value to the world. The other represented my value to them. I looked at the glass. They called me the dumb one for 20 years, but it took a mechanic to fix the engine they broke.